All right, so in the wake of Chris Smalls successfully organizing the first Amazon labor union here in the United States, as well as then taking a trip to go visit Kamala Harris and Joe Biden at the White House, the owner of Amazon, Jeffrey Bezos, is absolutely losing his mind and has decided to share some of his political opinions online, specifically on Twitter. So this is not something that he has done until very recently, and he's really been leaning into critiquing the Biden administration and really just putting his austerity opinions out there for the world to see, which is something that I think billionaires should be much more afraid of doing if we lived in a healthy society. I mean, there's no reason why somebody who's been amassing billions and billions of dollars, nearly doubling his fortune during the pandemic as average Americans are struggling, there's no way that in a healthy functioning society that these people should feel this confident in coming out and pushing the type of corporate propaganda that you're about to see here. But from Common Dreams, they say Bezos praises Manchin for blocking Biden's corporate tax hike. I wonder why he would be in agreement with Manchin on this. Well, they say billionaire Amazon founder Jeff Bezos praised Senator Joe Manchin's obstruction of his own party's anti-poverty and climate action agenda. It tells you everything you need to know about right-wing Democratic lawmaker, progressive organizers said on Sunday as Bezos weighed in on inflation and government spending. So what did he actually say? Well, I'm going to show you a couple of tweets here. But first off, obviously, as you can see, I'm actually blocked by the account neoliberal that he was quote tweeting here. So I think that's absolutely hilarious. No idea what I did to piss off this person who runs this account, but whatever. I'm not a neoliberal. I am a socialist. So, obviously we're going to have our disagreements here, but here's what they had to say. They said, "This is so silly," responding to Biden bragging about his lowering of the deficit. They said, "This is so silly. The deficit is decreasing because we're not doing pandemic aid anymore, and federal receipts are up because of inflation. Congress or the Biden administration didn't do anything to lower the deficit." So listen, first off, I don't really have any interest in arguing over whether or not Joe Biden can be fairly attributed to successfully lowering the deficit, because I don't really give a fuck about the deficit, and I don't think that you should either, because these people who are pushing this deficit hawk mindset, this austerity mindset of neoliberalism, they don't care about the deficit, okay? If they did, they would be focusing on things that we are dumping basically infinite sums of taxpayer dollars into with no accountability. Things like the Pentagon budget, where we shovel in nearly $1 trillion a year into the Pentagon, and they can't even give us an audit. They can't even pass an audit to tell us where this money is going. So if you actually cared about the debt and the deficit, you would be focusing on things like cutting the military budget in half, maybe at a bare minimum, or doing anything to actually, focus on taxing the rich, for example, or anything that would actually address the problem of the debt and deficit in a fundamental way. But of course, their logic and justifications in favoring lowering the debt and deficit is always going to be harming working class Americans. They just want to cut the social safety net in order to lower the debt and deficit. So you see exactly the talking points that they're putting forward here. But Jeff Bezos then responded to this tweet from neoliberal and said, "In fact, the administration tried hard to inject even more stimulus into an already overheated inflationary economy, and only Manchin saved them from themselves." Manchin saved them from themselves from preventing policies like the extension of the child tax credit, where once that failed to get re-upped, we saw millions and millions of children fall straight back into poverty, or things like free community college that would help to start address the issue of the student debt crisis that we have right now, or things like, lowering prescription drug costs for Americans by allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. So, all things that would actually help with help the American people deal with inflationary pressure. But those are all things that Jeff Bezos is perfectly in line with Joe Manchin in being against. He says they saved them from themselves, and he says inflation is a regressive tax that most hurts the least affluent. That's 100% true. And he says misdirection doesn't help the country. So I guess he's saying it's misdirection to say that Joe Biden is lowering the deficit, and it's misdirection to say that we could address the debt and deficit by taxing the rich, or by investing in these bold social programs that help average Americans. Not exactly sure exactly what he's pointing to, but the second tweet kind of clears that up a little bit. But again, this is Jeffrey Bezos, okay, one of the single richest men on the planet, number 1 or 2 depending on which day that you're checking, but one of the richest men in the planet, who has control over a corporation like Amazon that engages in widespread union busting, that doesn't pay their their federal taxes, that exploits workers domestically and around the world, all in an effort to make this motherfucker as rich as possible and give him the ability to go buy, multi-million-dollar super yachts that they have to dismantle bridges to get them out of the ports. So, it's very clear exactly where his biases lie in this, and it's not any surprise that he would side with somebody like Joe Manchin. But now we're going to get into this second tweet, which really clarifies a lot of what he's talking about here. But he says, look, a squirrel. So basically he's talking about the Biden administration responded to this initial tweet that he put out there, and I wanted to read this and then get to his response in it. But he's basically saying it's a distraction, and the Biden administration said it doesn't require a huge leap to figure out why one of the wealthiest individuals on earth opposes an economic agenda for the middle class that cuts some of the biggest costs families face, fights inflation for the long haul, and adds to the historic deficit reduction the president is achieving by asking the richest taxpayers and corporations to pay their fair share. It's also unsurprising that this tweet comes after the president met with labor organizers, including Amazon employees. So I personally think that's a great response from the Biden administration here. Obviously, there are still very valid criticisms to have about their inability to actually force Amazon to come to the table and negotiate union contracts, or using the leverage that they have by withholding federal contracts in order to pressure Amazon to stop their illegal union busting activities. There are definitely critiques that you can have, but rhetorically at least, I think this is a good response from the Biden administration. And Jeff Bezos took this and he says, look, a squirrel. This is the White House's statement about my recent tweets. They understandably want to muddy the topic. They know inflation hurts the neediest the most. Again, true. But unions aren't causing inflation, and neither are wealthy people. Okay, that's half true, because yeah, unions aren't causing inflation. Nobody was suggesting that. And he says, and neither are wealthy people. Well, we know according to the data that we'll get to here in a second, that wealthy people are very much responsible for the inflation that average Americans are experiencing right now. But he continues saying, remember, the administration tried their best to add another $3.5 trillion to federal spending. Again, very important context here, that this is not $3.5 trillion over the next year. It's $3.5 trillion over the next 10 years. So $350 billion a year, roughly half of our military budget. But they, of course, portray it in this larger number of as if that's supposed to be scary, that we would be spending money to invest in average Americans. But he says they tried their best to add another $3.5 trillion to federal spending. They failed, but if they had succeeded, inflation would be even higher than it is today. And inflation today is at a 40-year high. Well, again, why is inflation at a 40-year high right now? Well, partially it's to do with supply-side issues that have been caused by, the system of neoliberalism that we have implemented for decades in this country, where multinational U.S. corporations put their profits above the interests of working-class Americans, exported their jobs overseas, and created this complicated, barely, working on the margin system where, of course, you're going to have instability. Of course, you're going to have risks that are associated with that type of global interconnected marketplace when you're relying on other countries like China and, a bunch of other ones where we exported our manufacturing to. You're relying on them to supply our supply chains or to maintain our supply chains. So this system of global neoliberal capitalism is what led to a lot of the supply side issues that have been driving inflation. And yet he turns around and he says, you can't blame unions, you can't blame the wealthy people. Well, you could blame supply side issues, but you could also blame wealthy people. Okay, so I've talked about this data multiple times on this channel before, but here from Matt Stoller, I'll link this down below. It's a great read through, but he basically, calculates the data on where we're seeing inflation in different sectors of the economy and comes to the conclusion that corporate profits alone have been driving 60% of the inflation increases. So in other words, corporations are using this narrative of inflation that was initially driven largely by supply chain breakdowns, and then they use that narrative to further artificially drive up the costs for average Americans, whether it's at the gas pump or the grocery store, etc. They are artificially raising their prices as they are simultaneously recording record profits. So in other words, it's not exactly 100% a supply side issue, and it's definitely not a majority issue with too much government spending. That's just such a reductive and inaccurate way to look at what has been driving inflation primarily. It has been two major factors. None of them have anything to do with the COVID relief packages or the stimulus that went out to average Americans, or definitely not Build Back Better. The two things that have been the main proponents have been supply chain breakdowns, which again, you could blame the system of neoliberalism for that breakdown, okay? And number two is corporate profiteering, price gouging of the American people from billionaires and billion-dollar corporations like Amazon that Jeff Bezos is obviously the owner of. But Again, he says you can't blame wealthy people. Yeah, you fucking can. I mean, on so many different levels, whether it's on the systemic analysis of global capitalism or whether it's on the immediate price gouging that the American people have been subjected to by billionaires like Jeff Bezos. So at the end of the day, I mean, it's not surprising that somebody like Bezos would be siding with a completely corrupted politician like Joe Manchin. I mean, they're perfectly in line with their political philosophy of just serving corporate America, serving the military-industrial complex, and rejecting anything that is actually intended to benefit working class Americans. So it's pretty wild that we have billionaires who are just feeling confident enough to go and give their opinions like this out publicly. But nonetheless, we got guys like Jeff Bezos, guys like Elon Musk, who are relentlessly and publicly lobbying for austerity for working class Americans, while simultaneously completely, in a deranged way, lying about the fact of what is actually causing inflation. It has nothing to do, according to the evidence, with government spending. It has nothing to do with policies like lowering prescription drug prices that were on the table, or policies like the child tax credit, or any of these mild crumbs of stimulus that working class Americans got throughout the pandemic. It has way more disproportionately to do with billionaires and billion-dollar corporations who are price gouging the American people for their own profits. So ironically, I mean, I guess not really ironically, but counter to what Jeff Bezos is claiming here, the solution of taxing the wealthy, which is where the vast proportion of wealth exists in this country, that actually would lead to lowering inflation. If you think, inflation is due to too much money in an overheated economy, well, where is the money in our economy? It's sitting in the pockets of dudes like Jeff Bezos. It's sitting in the bank accounts and the asset holdings of companies like Amazon. So tax that wealth, tax those assets, and then you could actually reduce inflation while simultaneously passing policies like Build Back Better that would help inflation in a two-pronged way by raising those taxes on the wealthiest Americans and also giving Americans crumbs of stimulus to be able to support their families and create some semblance of stability in a post-pandemic world.